This is the Sony RX100 Mark VII. It is Sony's latest compact point-and-shoot camera. The RX100 series has been around for a number of years, but this is the first time that I have had my hands on one, and I didn't really know what to expect. I approached this review knowing that the camera has a 1-inch sensor, which is larger than your typical point-and-shoot camera, that I expect a lot from Sony, and also knowing that the small package was attractive to me for my outdoor adventuring, but also knowing that this is not an inexpensive camera. I was blown away by this little guy, and I realize that that sounds dramatic, but it's true. I think it is a fantastic option for anyone wanting more capability than their phone camera, but still wanting a pocketable solution. I will share a ton of photos and video in this review that I have captured in the last couple of weeks that I've had this, from hearing from my experience with it and seeing some of the results that I was able to achieve. You should be able to draw some of your own conclusions to decide if this camera might be right for you. And if not, hopefully you will at least enjoy the photos and videos that I share. I will share them throughout the video and then more at the end. I'm going to put some specs up on screen right now, but I won't go through all of them in this video. I will touch on all of the specifications that make sense within how I used the camera. Likewise, this camera is feature heavy. There are a lot of features on this camera that I simply didn't have time to play with in the 2 weeks that I've had it. So during my time with the camera and during this video, I have focused on how I would normally use the camera. Out for fun outings in town, like to the museum or a park, and on adventures like trail running or a jaunt to the Grand Canyon. In fact, you can see more from my day trip to the Grand Canyon in a video I made last week. I will link to it in the description. You will also see some of those photos and videos in this review as well. Let's begin with image quality. The images look great. If you are a hardcore photographer, you may note a lack of that sense of depth that you achieve with a larger sensor camera, but the vast majority of people wouldn't notice that difference because Sony has done a great job with the sensor, the lens, and how it all works together. This is what I mean. Using this Grand Canyon shot, zooming in to see details, you can see that you've got quite a bit to inspect. Even in the bottom corner here, you can see plateau point very clearly. Now, is this important? It may or may not be important to you. For a lot of folks, just seeing that overall image, not zoomed in, is the goal. For me, I want it. I do this for a living. I share photos with you all on a weekly basis. Each and every one of my photos needs to stand up to the scrutiny of the internet. And I was comfortable enough to make an entire video using this camera's photo and video, as well as post several images on social media. My point here is that while there are inherent differences in image characteristics with different size sensors, the overall image quality on this camera is stellar. Back on this same photo, one thing I should mention is that this image was shot in RAW and I edited it. The edited image looks significantly changed from the raw image straight out of the camera. But I simply used the sliders in Lightroom. I didn't do any selective editing or masking or anything fancy. And the same goes for all of the other images in this video. I found that the raw files out of the camera have a lot of editing latitude. So if that's important to you, that is definitely a benefit here. If raw files aren't your style, I did also shoot in JPEG. In JPEG, you can still do some editing, though of course not as much as with the raw files. Or I've heard from a great number of my viewers that you don't want to edit your images at all. So these are JPEGs straight out of the camera. I played around with the different creative styles in the camera to get a look that I liked, and there are a bunch of them. I mentioned the lens before and how it contributes to the image quality. Let's discuss this lens a little bit more. It will zoom from an effective field of view of 24 millimeters to 200 millimeters and has an aperture range of f2.8 to f4.5. And that means that at 24 millimeters, you can shoot at f2.8, which was handy for me when I was out before the sun was up. The lens could open up to a wide aperture for those wide angle landscapes. Now, when I zoomed in, my maximum aperture narrowed to f4.5, which is normal for point and shoot cameras. This is what the range of 24 to 200 looks like. This photo is at 200 millimeters, while here is the same scene at 24 millimeters. That cactus from the 200 millimeter photo is right here. In situations like this one, where I was running, I really liked having that capability in my hand. It's actually a lot of range. I just ran with the camera in my hand and just turned it on every time I wanted to take a photo. Speaking of running, how does this thing do for action? What if you wanted to take photos at your kid's soccer game or for some wildlife? It's pretty quick. You can shoot it up to 20 frames per second with autofocus and auto exposure. And I got a number of seconds at 20 frames per second. That's a lot of photos. I was using the fastest SD card available in the camera, but I was making the camera work for each shot, meaning that it was doing calculations. I was shooting shutter priority, auto ISO, and also shooting RAW plus JPEG large extra fine. And I got just shy of 100 frames before my buffer filled up and the camera slowed down. And the frames were usable. The bird I was tracking stayed in focus, at least until it was completely behind the trees. And then I was able to take more photos as the buffer was clearing. I was amazed by this. So seriously, listen. It's crazy. And if that isn't enough, there is actually a mode on this camera called single burst shooting, where you can shoot even faster in one quick burst. It will take 7 photos at a rate of 90 frames per second. That's so fast. It's for times when you know the moment you want is about to happen and you want a variety of shots from that one quick moment. So I just mentioned autofocus. Like pretty much everything else with this camera, I was pleasantly surprised at autofocus as well. The camera has both real-time face and eye detect autofocus for both still photos and video. It also has real-time animal eye autofocus for still photography, especially if you're in a situation where you're chasing around your kids or some jackrabbits, trying to get them in focus. You'll end up with more usable shots when you have this kind of tracking. I found that in those situations, this camera achieved autofocus quickly when I saw that bird in the sky, and then it did a good job tracking the subject as I was panning the camera to also follow the bird. Really, I found the autofocus to be very good overall. The camera has both contrast detect and phase detect autofocus, which no doubt helps. There were a couple of mornings where I was out before dawn where the camera struggled to achieve focus, but these were very low light situations. Even full frame and APS-C cameras from just a handful of years ago would have really struggled in those situations. I simply switched the camera over to manual focus and used the focus ring on the lens. Now, sticking with those low light situations, that's really the only time that I found the camera to struggle. Autofocus got less reliable and the images were very noisy. However, I was using very low light situations and I did not use flash in those situations. This camera does have a pop-up flash that you might like using. And really for me, I wouldn't expect the camera to do particularly well in those situations. To be fair, even if I had been using an APS-C or full frame camera, I was pushing it and I would have had similar issues. Now let's touch on video. I mostly shot video at 4K at 30 frames per second. You can also shoot in 1080p, which I did experiment with as well. Using my rudimentary color grading skills in Final Cut Pro, on that 4K video, I went from this to this. So, like with the RAW files of my still photos, I was pleasantly surprised by how much I could adjust the look of the video files. Also, the camera does include stabilization. You can even adjust the stabilization to be more or less active for different situations you may find yourself in. I shot this footage of a coyote handheld at 200 millimeters. So you can see that it's a little unsteady, but this footage would have been unusable if the stabilization was not available. Also, the LCD screen will flip up and face you so that you can see yourself. I did try this out vlog style where I held the camera out and pointed it at myself. Here's what happened. Video test out in the wild. I am using the onboard microphone. I am using program mode and auto ISO, auto white balance, and then just the standard colors. The sky looks much brighter in my flippy screen than it does in real life. But here it is. How does it look? I'm in 4K at 30 frames per second. So it looks like stabilization is doing a real good job. But I'm in the desert, everyone. How do I sound? Looks great. And it was easy to use with the flip up screen. I was impressed by the onboard audio as well, but you do have a microphone jack. I did not test that out. For me, the beauty of this camera is just to keep it compact, and not only would the external microphone add size, you would need to use a bracket of some sort because there is no hot shoe on the camera. And the flip up screen would get in the way anyway. So for me, it would be less than ideal. Let's discuss overall usability a little bit more. I think that the ease of use of a camera is just as important as the image quality and specifications. If you have trouble using the camera, you're probably not going to use the camera very much. So who cares how great the images could potentially be, right? One thing I loved was the pop-up viewfinder. When I was in bright conditions or when I just wanted to use it, I could pop it up. But then I could tuck it away and keep that small form factor. I also appreciated that the buttons are easy to push, even when I had gloves on. The video record button in particular has a cozy little notch that you can feel and press the button without looking at it. Speaking of gloves, I did use the camera in the snow and it did get a little wet. So although this camera isn't super weatherproofed, a few drops of water didn't break it. In addition to the buttons and dials being easy to use, likewise, the menus were easy for me to navigate because I am somewhat familiar with the menus of Sony's larger cameras. The terminology is the same and the organization of the menus appears very similar. Now, some people who are new to Sony might be a little intimidated looking at the menus because there are a lot of options, but I wouldn't let that prevent you from using Sony in general. You can definitely just pull this camera out of the box and shoot it as is with all of the default settings, or check out the manual as needed to make changes. I actually like to download the PDF of the manual and keep it on my phone just in case I run into problems. On to battery life. The camera is rated to be able to take 240 to 310 images per charge, or 40 to 70 minutes of video. I think I did better than that though. I didn't actually measure it. You can charge this guy via micro USB though. So when I was at the Grand Canyon for several hours taking photos and video constantly, I just plugged it in between stops and I had no issues. If I were to take this out on an all-day hike, I would bring a battery pack and be comfortable that I was able to take photos and video all day and just plug this in every so often. Okay, real talk. Let's discuss price. I will put a link in the description so that you can see how much this is in your area, but when I asked you all for questions on this camera, a viewer pointed out that there are other point-and-shoot cameras that can be had for much less money, and even relatively compact interchangeable lens cameras with larger sensors that can be purchased for the same or less money. This viewer's question was, is this worth it? And I think that's a great question. I think it's something that we probably all should ask ourselves every time we make any large purchase. But the answer will be different for everyone. If you don't mind a larger camera, maybe an entry-level interchangeable lens camera kit would be a smarter choice for you, just from a cost standpoint. But you will be trading off some features like frames per second and zoom range, though your image quality may improve depending on what lens you get. I think the strength of this camera is that you get a lot of capability and the capacity to capture high quality images in a really compact body. Now, there are other compact cameras that offer lots of great specifications. But if you're already shooting Sony or you just prefer this camera over the other options for one reason or another, this is a good choice. Like I said, it really depends on you. What specifications are important to you? Which camera system seems to be easier or more enjoyable for you to use? Not to mention your budget. I have to box this up and send it back to Sony now because it's just a loaner. I don't want to send it back though. While it wouldn't replace my interchangeable lens bodies, I think this would be a really nice addition to my pack of cameras. I particularly enjoyed just grabbing it and heading out for a trail run with it. I literally just held it while I ran. That's really where I would get the most use, is on my outdoor adventures where I don't want to bring a big camera setup because I'd have to like pull it in and out of a bag. This is just so easy to bring with me. Unfortunately, I can't buy every camera I want, so this one won't be on my shelves, at least not yet. Although I do have to send this back today, let me know if you have any questions about my experience with it. I'd be happy to provide any insights that I can. And that's all for today. Thanks for watching.